Welcome back to Convicted of Murder but Innocent. We're taking a deep dive into a case that really makes you question the justice system. It's the story of Melissa Lucio.
Oh, this one is heavy.
Right, just try and picture this. You're a mother, you are grieving, you just lost your child, and then suddenly you're the one being accused of murder.
That's just, wow.
I know, right? The stakes couldn't get any higher. Melissa ended up on death row.
It's terrifying, honestly. And what makes Melissa's case even more complex is the fact that she was a mother of 14 and dealing with so many challenges.
Yeah, life was definitely not easy for her. Then in 2007, her daughter, Mariah, passed away. It seemed like a tragic accident, a fall, something that could happen to any child. So how in the world did this turn into a murder charge?
That's where the interrogation comes in. What Melissa went through during those hours of questioning really shows why it's so important to understand how coerced confessions happen.
I've always wondered about that.
Yeah, so imagine this. You're pregnant, you're completely heartbroken over your child's death, and then they put you through this intense, relentless interrogation.
Oh, I can't even imagine.
Exactly. You're so vulnerable, and they're asking you leading questions, putting all this pressure on you. It's not surprising that Melissa ended up confessing.
So then the question is, was she really admitting to something she did, or was she just desperate to stop the questioning?
That is the million-dollar question. How do we know the difference between a true confession and one that was, I don't know, forced out of someone?
It seems like that would be so hard to tell.
Right, and that's where organizations like the Innocence Project come in.
They do amazing work.
They really do. They have experts who go over those interrogation tapes looking for any signs of coercion.
Wow, so it's not just what's being said, but also how it's said, like the whole context of the interrogation.
Exactly. They look for patterns, things like leading questions, threats, promises, even stuff like sleep deprivation.
Sleep deprivation.
Yeah, it can wear a person down, cloud their judgment.
Makes sense. I mean, all of that can influence what someone might say, even if it's not true.
Right, and that's why Melissa Lucio's case is so important. It exposes these flaws in how interrogations are done. It shows that confessions, even though they seem like the ultimate proof, can be very unreliable.
It really makes you think, how many other cases are out there where someone confessed under duress?
It's a scary thought. And unfortunately, it happens more often than people realize.
So let's move on to the actual trial. We know the prosecution relied heavily on Melissa's confession. But there's another part of this story that raises some serious questions about the evidence. The forensic evidence, specifically the autopsy findings.
Right, there were some big issues there.
So what exactly were the problems with the autopsy? How did they affect how the jury saw Melissa?
Well, the initial autopsy findings seemed to support Mariah, Melissa's daughter, had a pre-existing blood clotting disorder.
Wait, so a medical condition she already had could be mistaken as abuse? That's terrifying.
It is, and it comes down to a lack of communication and not considering all the possibilities.
Yeah, it seems like that happens way too often.
In Mariah's case, that blood clotting disorder wasn't really factored into the interpretation of the autopsy, so it made her injuries seem way worse than they might have been, even from a simple fall. And that fueled the suspicion of abuse.
Oh, wow. So it's like once that idea of abuse took hold, they saw everything through that lens.
Exactly, like tunnel vision. And unfortunately, that kind of tunnel vision can have devastating consequences.
Right. In Melissa's case, it led to a conviction based on evidence that wasn't complete and might have even been misleading.
But the story doesn't end there.
Thank goodness. So organizations like the Innocence Project got involved, bringing a new perspective to Melissa's case. What did they uncover that started to challenge that original conviction?
Well, they brought in medical experts who took another look at Mariah's medical history and those autopsy findings. And these experts argued that Mariah's injuries, as tragic as they were, actually fit with an accidental fall, especially considering her blood clotting disorder.
So what you're saying is they challenged the core of the prosecution's case, both the confession and the physical evidence.
Exactly. And that's the power of having these independent experts. They bring a fresh set of eyes, unbiased by those initial assumptions. They can dissect the evidence and offer a much more objective analysis.
And in Melissa's case, their analysis painted a whole different picture. Like they were putting together a puzzle that had been assembled wrong, finally revealing the true image.
It's a great way to put it. But overturning a conviction, especially a death penalty case, is incredibly difficult.
Yeah, the legal system isn't exactly known for being quick to change.
It's like turning a giant ship around. But things did start to change for Melissa. The Innocence Project and all her supporters kept pushing, raising awareness, and fighting for her.
It really shows how important those organizations are. They don't just find these potential cases, they fight for justice, even when the odds are stacked against them.
They're like detectives, piecing together the truth and then using it to challenge the system. And in Melissa's case, their efforts started to work. She got stays of execution, which bought her valuable time. And public support started to grow.
It's amazing how public awareness can sometimes tip the scales of justice. Like when enough people start asking questions and demanding answers, it puts pressure on those in power to take another look.
It really shows the power of people coming together. And for Melissa, that public pressure played a big role in what eventually happened. As more people learned about her story and the problems with the evidence, the demand for justice just kept growing.
So this is where I start to feel hopeful. Even with all the challenges, the truth had a fighting chance.
Right. It's inspiring.
It makes me wonder, for our listeners out there, are there ways they can support organizations like the Innocence Project? Like, how can they help fight for justice?
Absolutely. We'll definitely share some resources at the end of this deep dive. There are so many ways to help, whether it's donating, volunteering, or just spreading awareness.
That's fantastic. So back to Melissa's case. With all this momentum building, new evidence, and public support, what happened next? Was the conviction overturned?
Yes, it was. After years of fighting in court, Melissa was granted a stay of execution in 2022. And just a few months later, a Texas appeals court actually overturned her conviction.
Wow, what a victory.
They pointed to the coerced confession and that misleading medical evidence as the main reasons.
That must have been an incredible moment for Melissa and everyone who was fighting for her. But I imagine the fight wasn't over just yet, right?
You're right. Overturning the conviction was huge, but it didn't mean Melissa was totally free. The prosecution could still try her again, and at first that's what they planned to do.
So even with the conviction gone, she was still facing another trial, another potential guilty verdict.
It's crazy, right? But then something unexpected happened. The Cameron County District Attorney actually decided to drop all the charges against Melissa in 2023.
Wow. So after all that, after years of fighting for her life, she was finally free.
She was. After almost 15 years in prison for something she didn't do, Melissa Lucio was exonerated and released.
It's incredible. Really shows her strength and the dedication of those who fought alongside her.
I know, right.
It's a powerful reminder that even when things seem impossible, hope and justice can prevail. But as we celebrate this victory, we have to remember that Melissa's story, while extraordinary, is not unique. There are so many others who have been wrongfully convicted who are still in prison, their voices silenced.
Absolutely. Melissa's case is a beacon of hope, but it also exposes the deep problems in our justice system. It's a call to action for all of us to look at these flaws, demand change, and fight for a system that actually delivers justice, not just convictions.
It's a sobering thought, but one we need to face. Melissa's case is a wake-up call. We need to look beyond individual stories of injustice and examine those systemic flaws that allowed this to happen.
Absolutely. It's a complex issue, but we can't ignore it.
So what are some key takeaways, lessons we can learn from Melissa's experience, and how can we prevent these miscarriages of justice?
I think one of the most important takeaways is that our justice system, even though it tries to be fair, isn't perfect. Mistakes happen, and those mistakes can have terrible consequences. Melissa's case shows how a combination of things, a forced confession, misleading evidence, and systemic biases can lead to a wrongful conviction.
It really emphasizes the need for constant vigilance and reform in our legal system. What are some specific things we can do to address these issues and prevent these wrongful convictions in the future? Earlier, you mentioned the importance of changing how interrogations are done, and that really struck me. What would those reforms look like?
Well, we need to get rid of those coercive tactics that can lead to false confessions, especially from people who are vulnerable. Implementing mandatory video recording of interrogations can increase transparency and accountability. Imagine being able to see and hear the entire interrogation process. It would help prevent potential abuse.
That makes perfect sense. And I think for the average person who's never been in an interrogation room, it's hard to understand how intense and psychologically draining it can be. You mentioned other things too, like misleading forensic evidence. What can we do to make sure evidence is presented accurately and fairly?
Investing in proper training for those forensic analysts and setting clear standards for how evidence is collected and analyzed is crucial. Jurors often see forensic evidence as undeniable proof, so we have to make sure it's accurate. No room for doubt or misinterpretation.
It's like building a house if the foundation's weak. The whole thing is at risk. Same with a legal case. If the evidence is unreliable, the entire case is on shaky ground. We also can't forget about bias, right? Implicit bias in the justice system is a huge problem we can't ignore.
Exactly. Addressing implicit bias requires ongoing education and training for everyone involved, from the police and prosecutors to the judges and juries. We need to acknowledge these biases exist, understand how they affect our decisions, and actively work to reduce their impact.
It's complicated, but we can't shy away from it. To have a more just system, we have to recognize and fight against those biases at every level. And of course, access to quality legal representation is essential.
You're absolutely right. Everyone, no matter their background, deserves a fair trial and a good lawyer. Quality legal representation shouldn't be a privilege only for the wealthy. It's a fundamental right that must be protected.
It all comes back to that basic idea, equal justice under the law. That's what we should all be aiming for. As we wrap up this deep dive into Melissa Lucio's case, I keep thinking about the human cost of these wrongful convictions. It's not just the years spent in prison, it's the shattered lives, the lost relationships, the stolen time that can never be replaced.
You've hit on a very important point. The emotional and psychological damage of being wrongfully convicted is profound. It affects not just the individual, but also their families and communities. Each case is a stark reminder of how fragile freedom is and the huge responsibility we have to protect justice.
So where do we go from here? What's the next step? What can our listeners do if they want to get involved in creating a fairer legal system?
Well, first off, if you're feeling motivated to take action, we'll share resources at the end of our deep dive where you can find ways to support similar cases. You can learn more about organizations like the Innocence Project, donate, volunteer, or simply spread awareness. Every action, no matter how small, can make a difference.
That's such an important reminder. We can all be part of the solution. Educating ourselves about the issues, supporting organizations fighting for justice, or speaking up when we see injustice. We all have a role to play in making the world a fairer place. Melissa's story is a testament to the power of perseverance, the importance of second chances, and the unwavering belief in justice, even when it seems impossible. And for those who want to learn more about Melissa Lucio's case and how to support these efforts, we encourage you to visit https://tinyurl.com/COMBI podcast for a wealth of resources and ways to get involved. We can all play a role in ensuring that justice prevails.
Absolutely. We can't let up. We have to keep challenging the system and fighting for a system that upholds fairness, equality, and justice for everyone.
Thank you for listening to the Convicted of Murder but Innocent podcast. It's a sobering thought, but one we need to confront. Melissa's case is a wake-up call, urging us to look beyond individual stories of injustice and really examine those systemic flaws that allow these tragedies to happen. What are some of the key takeaways, the lessons we can glean from Melissa's experience, and what can we do to prevent these miscarriages of justice from happening again?
Well, I think one of the most important things to recognize is that our justice system, while it aims for fairness, isn't perfect. Mistakes happen, and unfortunately, those mistakes can have devastating consequences. Melissa's case is a really clear example of how different factors can combine a forced confession, misleading evidence, systemic biases, all contributing to a wrongful conviction.
It really underscores the need for constant vigilance and reform within our legal system. What are some concrete things that can be done to address these issues and prevent future wrongful convictions? You talked about reforming interrogation techniques earlier, and that really stuck with me. What would those reforms actually look like?
Well, for one, we've got to move away from those coercive interrogation tactics that can lead to false confessions, especially from vulnerable individuals. Implementing mandatory video recording of interrogations would be huge for transparency and accountability.
That makes a lot of sense.
Right. Imagine if we could see and hear the entire interrogation process. It would help safeguard against potential abuse.
Absolutely. And I think for someone who's never been in that kind of interrogation room, it's hard to grasp how intense and psychologically draining that experience can be.
You mentioned misleading forensic evidence, too. How can we ensure that the evidence presented is accurate and unbiased?
Investing in proper training for forensic analysts and establishing clear standards for collecting and analyzing evidence is key. Jurors often see forensic evidence as this absolute proof, so its accuracy is critical. We need to eliminate any room for doubt or misinterpretation.
It's like building a house. A shaky foundation puts the whole structure at risk. Same with a legal case. Unreliable evidence means the whole case is on shaky ground. And of course, there's the issue of bias.
Implicit bias within the justice system is a huge factor that we can't ignore.
Absolutely. Addressing implicit bias requires ongoing education and training for everyone involved in the legal process, from police officers and prosecutors to judges and juries. We need to acknowledge that these biases exist, understand how they influence our perceptions and decisions, and actively work to mitigate their impact.
It's a complex problem, but one we can't avoid. Creating a more just system means recognizing and actively combating these biases at every level. And of course, we can't forget about access to quality legal representation.
Absolutely crucial. Everyone, regardless of their socioeconomic background, deserves a fair trial and competent legal representation. Access to quality legal counsel shouldn't be a privilege reserved for the wealthy. It's a fundamental right that must be protected and upheld.
It all comes back to that core principle: equal justice under the law. That's what we're striving for. As we wrap up this deep dive into Melissa Lucio's case, I keep thinking about the human cost of these wrongful convictions. It's not just about the years spent behind bars, it's the shattered lives, the lost relationships, the time stolen that can never be recovered.
You've hit on a profound point. The emotional and psychological scars of wrongful conviction run deep, and they impact families, communities, and society as a whole. Each case is a stark reminder of the fragility of freedom and the immense responsibility we have to safeguard justice.
So where does this leave us? What's the next step? What can our listeners do if they're feeling moved by Melissa's story and want to get involved in the fight for a more just legal system?
Well, if you're feeling outraged, like we are, and want to take action, we'll share resources at the end of our deep dive where you can find ways to support similar cases. You can learn more about organizations like the Innocence Project, find ways to donate, volunteer your time, or simply spread awareness about these critical issues. Every action, no matter how small, can make a difference.
That's such an important reminder. We can all be agents of change. Whether it's educating ourselves, supporting organizations fighting for justice, or speaking up when we see injustice happening, we all have a role to play in creating a more just and equitable world. Melissa's story is a testament to the power of perseverance, the importance of second chances, and the unwavering belief in the possibility of justice, even when all hope seems lost. And for those who want to learn more about Melissa Lucio's case and how to support these efforts, we encourage you to visit https://tinyurl.com/COMBI podcast for a wealth of resources and ways to get involved. We can all play a role in ensuring that justice prevails.
Absolutely. We have to stay vigilant, challenge the status quo, and never stop fighting for a system that truly upholds fairness, equality, and justice for all.
Thank you for listening to the Convicted of Murder but Innocent podcast. It's a lot to process, but it's the reality we're facing. So where do we go from here? What can our listeners do if they're as disturbed by Melissa's story as we are? How can people get involved in the fight for a more just legal system?
Well, if you're feeling that outrage and want to do something, we'll be sharing some resources at the end of this deep dive. You can find ways to support similar cases. You can learn more about organizations like the Innocence Project, donate, volunteer your time, even just spread awareness. Every little bit helps.
It really does. It's a reminder that we all have the power to create change. Whether it's learning more about these issues, supporting those organizations fighting for justice, or speaking up when we see injustice happening. We can all contribute to a fairer world. Melissa's story is just incredible. It shows the power of perseverance, second chances, and that belief in justice, even when it seems impossible. And for those who want to learn more about Melissa Lucio's case and how to support these efforts, we encourage you to visit https://tinyurl.com/COMBI podcast for more information and ways to get involved. We can all play a role in ensuring that justice wins.
Absolutely. We have to stay aware, keep challenging the system, and never stop fighting for fairness and equality for everyone.
Thank you for listening to Convicted of Murder but Innocent.